On September 28, 2025, a man drove his vehicle through the walls of a church in Michigan, stepped out into the chaos he had created. He started firing into a congregation of families who had gathered to worship. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a sudden break. This was the final act of a mind that had been unraveling for years, fueled by an obsession so consuming that it transformed a human being into something unrecognizable. What you are about to hear is not just a story of violence. It is a psychological descent into the darkest corners of ideological hatred, and it raises a question that should terrify us all. How does a person become so lost in their own mind that they see mass murder as the only answer? Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The morning of September 28th began like any other Sunday in Grand Blanc Township, a quiet community in Genesee County, Michigan. Families arrived at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints building, greeting one another with the familiar warmth of a close-knit congregation. Children ran through the parking lot. Parents carried diaper bags and scripture cases. Inside, the chapel was filling with people preparing for their weekly service. No one noticed the vehicle idling at the edge of the property. No one saw the man behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. No one could have known that in the next few minutes, their lives would be shattered by a violence so calculated, so deliberate, that it would leave investigators struggling to comprehend the depth of hatred required to carry it out. At approximately 10:47 a.m., the vehicle accelerated. It did not swerve. It did not hesitate. It drove directly into the side of the church building with enough force to breach the exterior wall. The sound was catastrophic. Metal twisted, concrete crumbled. Inside, the congregation froze in confusion and terror. What had just happened? Was it an accident? A structural failure? The answer came seconds later when the driver's door opened and a man emerged, armed and ready to continue what he had started. He opened fire inside the building. The psychological terror of that moment cannot be overstated. These were people in a place of worship, a space they associated with safety, community, and peace. The cognitive dissonance alone, the inability to reconcile what was happening with where they were, would have been paralyzing. Fight or flight responses kicked in, but in the chaos, in the noise, in the sheer impossibility of what was unfolding, many people simply could not process the reality fast enough to react. This is what makes attacks on religious spaces so psychologically devastating. They are violations not just of physical safety, but of spiritual sanctuary. They are attacks on the very concept of refuge. But the gunfire was not the end. The attacker had brought incendiary devices. He deployed them inside the building. Flames began to spread. Smoke filled the air. Now the congregation faced not one threat, but three: gunfire, fire, and structural collapse. The psychological calculus of survival became impossibly complex. Do you run toward the exit and risk being shot? Do you hide and risk being burned? Do you try to help others and risk your own life? These are the kinds of decisions no human being should ever have to make, and yet in that moment, dozens of people were forced to make them in seconds. Would you have run? Would you have hidden? Would you have tried to fight back? Law enforcement arrived within minutes, but by then the damage had been done. The attacker was neutralized, but the scene inside the church was one of devastation. Investigators would later describe it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had encountered, not because of the scale of casualties, but because of the clear evidence of premeditation and ideological intent. This was not a random act of violence. This was a targeted attack on a specific religious community, carried out by someone who had spent considerable time planning every detail. The investigation that followed would reveal a psychological profile that is as chilling as it is instructive. The attacker was a 36-year-old man with no prior criminal record, no history of violent behavior, and no obvious red flags that would have placed him on law enforcement's radar. To his neighbors, he was quiet, perhaps a bit withdrawn but not threatening. To his coworkers, he was competent but distant. To his family, he had become increasingly isolated over the past several years, but they attributed it to personal struggles, not to the kind of radicalization that was actually taking place inside his mind. Because that is what this was, radicalization. Not in the traditional sense of joining a terrorist organization or being recruited by an extremist group, but in the more insidious, more common form of self-radicalization. The attacker had developed an obsessive hatred of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Investigators found evidence that he had spent years consuming anti-LDS content online. immersing himself in conspiracy theories, distorted historical narratives, and extremist rhetoric that painted the church and its members as enemies. He had no personal connection to the church. He had not been wronged by any member of the congregation. His hatred was entirely ideological, entirely abstract, and yet it had become the defining feature of his identity. This is the terrifying reality of ideological fixation. It does not require personal grievance. It does not require direct harm. It only requires a mind that is vulnerable, isolated, and searching for meaning. The attacker had found that meaning in hatred. He had constructed an entire worldview in which the LDS Church represented everything he believed was wrong with society, and he had convinced himself that violence against it was not just justified but necessary. This is the psychology of the extremist. The ability to dehumanize an entire group of people to the point where their suffering becomes not just acceptable, but desirable. Do you think someone in his life could have seen this coming? Do you think there were warning signs that were missed, or was this the kind of internal deterioration that happens entirely in the shadows? The evidence suggests it was the latter. The attacker had become a master of compartmentalization. He maintained a functional exterior while his internal world was collapsing into obsession and rage. He went to work. He paid his bills. He interacted with people in ways that seemed normal enough. But in private, he was spending hours every day consuming content that reinforced his hatred, planning an attack that he believed would send a message, make a statement, force the world to acknowledge his grievances. This is the pattern we see again and again in cases of ideologically motivated violence. The attacker believes they are acting on behalf of some greater truth, some higher purpose, when in reality they are simply acting out the final stages of their own psychological disintegration. The planning was meticulous. Investigators found evidence that he had surveilled the church for weeks, possibly months. He knew the layout of the building. He knew when services were held. He knew when the congregation would be at its largest. He had acquired the weapons and incendiary devices well in advance. He had written notes, not a manifesto in the traditional sense, but fragments of thought that revealed the depth of his obsession. Phrases like asterisk, they need to understand asterisk and asterisk, this is the only way asterisk appeared repeatedly. These are the words of someone who has lost the ability to see any path forward other than violence. These are the words of someone who has convinced themselves that destruction is a form of communication. But here's the question that haunts every investigator, every psychologist, every person who tries to make sense of cases like this. What was the tipping point? What was the moment when obsession became intent, when hatred became action? Was there a specific event that pushed him over the edge, or was it simply the accumulation of years of isolation, resentment, and ideological reinforcement? The truth is, we may never know. The human mind is not a linear system. It does not follow predictable patterns. It is entirely possible that there was no single moment, no dramatic turning point, but rather a slow, steady erosion of empathy, rationality, and connection to reality. This is what makes cases like this so psychologically disturbing. They remind us that the capacity for extreme violence exists not in monsters, but in ordinary people who have lost their way. The attacker was not born evil. He was not genetically predisposed to commit mass violence. He was a person who, through a combination of personal vulnerability, social isolation, and ideological exposure, became something else entirely. He became a person for whom the suffering of others was not just acceptable, but necessary to validate his own sense of purpose. The aftermath of the attack has left the Grand Blanc Township community grappling with questions that have no easy answers. How do you protect against an attacker who has no prior record, no obvious warning signs, no connection to the target? How do you identify someone who is radicalizing in private, consuming extremist content in the isolation of their own home, planning violence that they believe is justified? These are the questions that law enforcement, mental health professionals, and community leaders are struggling with in the wake of this attack. But there is another question, one that is perhaps even more important. How do we, as a society, address the conditions that allow this kind of radicalization to take root? The attacker did not create his hatred in a vacuum. He found it online, in communities that reinforced his beliefs, in content that validated his grievances, in echo chambers that told him he was right to feel the way he did. He was not recruited by a terrorist organization. He was radicalized by algorithms, by recommendation engines, by the endless availability of content that confirmed his worst impulses. This is the new face of extremism, and it is far more difficult to combat than the old models of organized terror. Would you have been able to recognize the signs if you knew him? Would you have seen the obsession growing, or would it have been invisible until it was too late? The psychological profile that has emerged from this case is one that should concern us all. The attacker exhibited what experts call target fixation, a condition in which a person becomes so obsessed with a particular individual, group, or institution that it dominates their thoughts, their emotions, their entire sense of identity. This fixation is often accompanied by a process of dehumanization, in which the target is no longer seen as human beings with their own lives, families, and struggles, but as symbols, as representations of everything the attacker believes is wrong with the world. Once this dehumanization is complete, violence becomes not just possible, but logical. It becomes the only way to resolve the cognitive dissonance between the attacker's beliefs and the reality that refuses to conform to them. This is the psychology of the ideological extremist, and it is not limited to any one belief system, any one political ideology, any one religious tradition. It can emerge anywhere that isolation, grievance, and ideological reinforcement come together. It can happen to anyone who is vulnerable, who is searching for meaning, who is willing to trade empathy for certainty. The attacker in Grand Blanc Township was not unique. He was not an anomaly. He was a product of conditions that exist all around us, conditions that we have not yet figured out how to address. The investigation also revealed evidence of what psychologists call identity crisis, leading to violence. The attacker had experienced significant personal setbacks in the years leading up to the attack. He had lost a job. He had gone through a difficult breakup. He had become increasingly isolated from friends and family. These are not uncommon experiences. Many people go through periods of loss, disappointment, and isolation without turning to violence. But for some, these experiences become the catalyst for a search for meaning, for purpose, for a way to make sense of their suffering. And if that search leads them to extremist ideology, if it leads them to communities that offer simple answers to complex questions, if it leads them to believe that their pain is the result of some external enemy, then the risk of violence increases exponentially. The attacker had found his enemy in the LDS Church. He had convinced himself that his personal struggles were somehow connected to the existence of this religious community, that his pain would be validated if he could inflict pain on them. This is the twisted logic of the extremist mind, the belief that destruction is a form of creation, that violence is a form of communication, that suffering is a form of justice. Do you think this was inevitable, or do you think there was a moment when he could have been reached, when someone could have intervened and changed the trajectory of his life? The truth is, we will never know. What we do know is that on September 28, 2025, a man made a choice. He chose to drive his vehicle into a church. He chose to open fire on a congregation. He chose to deploy incendiary devices in a building filled with families. These were not impulsive decisions. These were not crimes of passion. These were the culmination of years of obsession, hatred, and psychological deterioration. And they have left a community forever changed. The survivors of the attack will carry the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They will struggle with trauma, with anxiety, with the constant fear that it could happen again. They will question their faith, their safety, their ability to trust the world around them. This is the true cost of ideological violence, not just the immediate physical harm, but the long-term psychological devastation that ripples out from the epicenter of the attack, touching everyone who was there, everyone who knew someone who was there, everyone who hears the story and realizes that it could have been them. The Grand Blanc Township church attack is a case study in the psychology of extremism, in the process by which ordinary people become capable of extraordinary violence. It is a reminder that the greatest threats we face are not always external, not always organized, not always predictable. Sometimes they come from within our own communities, from people who have lost their connection to empathy, to reality, to the basic human recognition that other people are not symbols or abstractions, but living, breathing individuals with their own hopes, fears, and right to exist. As investigators continue to piece together the full picture of what happened that day, as psychologists analyze the attacker's mindset, as the community works to heal, we are left with a question that has no easy answer. How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we identify the warning signs of radicalization before it is too late? How do we create a society in which people who are struggling, who are isolated, who are searching for meaning, find connection and support instead of hatred and violence? These are the questions that will define our response to cases like this. These are the questions that will determine whether we can break the cycle of ideological violence, or whether we will continue to see attacks like the one in Grand Blanc Township, carried out by people who have convinced themselves that destruction is the only path to meaning. The attack on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc Township was not just a crime. It was a psychological event, a manifestation of the darkest possibilities of the human mind when it is left to spiral into obsession, hatred, and ideological fixation. It was a reminder that the capacity for violence exists not in monsters, but in people who have lost their way. And it was a warning that we ignore at our peril. The conditions that created this attacker still exist, and they are creating others even as you read these words. What will it take for us to recognize the signs? What will it take for us to intervene before obsession becomes violence? What will it take for us to build a society in which people find connection instead of hatred, support instead of isolation, meaning instead of destruction? The answers to these questions may determine whether the Grand Blanc Township church attack remains a singular tragedy, or whether it becomes one more entry in a growing list of ideologically motivated violence that we have failed to prevent. The choice, as always, is ours. But the clock is ticking, and the next person who is spiraling into obsession, who is consuming extremist content, who is planning an attack they believe is justified, may already be too far gone to reach. Can we afford to wait and find out?